won't say how old. He got up in the morning, and he was still working. He got up in the morning, rolled out of bed, grabbed his coffee, did his stuff, and then kissed his wife, as you do, dutiful husbands. I'm sorry, Dave, I'm looking at you for some reason. Kissed his wife goodbye, got in the car, and headed off to work. Anyway, so wife gets up, she's on the news, and she sees like live news coverage and of this guy going down the M1 the wrong way. And the helicopters are flying and all of that. So she's like, Herman goes to work that way. So she then picks up the phone, phones Herman on the mobile. Herman's driving to work, mobile goes, he picks up the phone, and he says to his wife, Herman, please be careful. There's somebody driving down the M1 the wrong way. Herman's response is, darling, it's not just one, it's hundreds of people. Boom, boom. Hey, listen, we're in this zone, aren't we? That the church should be countercultural. We need to be distinct. There are times and seasons in the church's life and us as a community and how we live and have our being that is going to cause us to push back against the crowd and to go against the flow. In fact, someone once said, only dead fish go with the flow. There is a sense where we as a community of people who belong to Jesus, we are going to be different and we are going to be distinct. And the world needs to see that and experience that. And actually, that should also be a deeply attractive thing as well. A couple of weeks ago, we talked a little bit about being countercultural and not becoming a people that are so submerged in our own culture that there is no real difference between how we live and other people live. And then there are we call them submariners. They're so submerged in culture that there is no real distinct difference. And then others where the church has done this over a millennia, where we've pulled back from culture and society and created our own little world, and everything is different, but we have no connection with the world and with people. And the Jesus model is that we are to be a people, to be deeply connected to people, but also to challenge some stuff in the world. And wouldn't it be amazing that we as a people were known for being distinct, not just around our ethical and our moral differences, but because of how we love people, how we are patient with people, how much more kind this group of people are. Wouldn't it be brilliant that in the news, it starts to this group of people called Christians in the UK, man, they are so kind to people. And so we hear more positive press about the differences that Christians make in our society rather than the slightly more negative perceptions that often are around. I want to tell you a moment in my life. I was 14 years old when a distinctiveness of the church impacted my life. So some of you know my mum and dad were missionaries in India. And at 13, 14 years old, after nearly 8 years of living in the Himalayas, we came back to the UK. And I dreamt of getting a bike. And some of you might know the story, some of you might not. And so one of the first things that Mum and Dad did, and they were skint, they were pretty poor, but they managed to get me a second-hand bike, a racer, so I could get about. I was like, this is a great bike. It opened up a world of friendships that I could jump on a bike and go and see my friends in other parts of the town, It got nicked. Within about 2 months of having it, my dad had put it on a rack at the side of the house and chained it. We'd gone away, and bandits had gone in, cut the chain, and stole this bike. And to be honest with you, it wasn't like a carbon fiber racer, it wasn't, but it was a nice little bike, and it was my bike, and I was absolutely gutted. And Christmas was coming, and my dad had come home, and he was back on the dole. He was on benefits, so he was trying to find a job. Life wasn't easy. Mum and Dad had shared with us as a family, hey, listen, it's a proper family Christmas, but don't expect like masses of presents, And at 14, you're like, okay, that's fine, because we're nice kids. Anyway, Christmas came. We had a great Christmas. We opened some presents. You do. I don't know how you guys do Christmas, but in our house, my mom's a teacher, so everything has order. If you know what I mean. So you come down, and it's not a free-for-all. So it's like you come down and you all get your presents out and you go in a circle and you open them up and go, oh, look, socks, yay. Oh, look, big pants, yay. And you work your way around. Anyway, so we'd done all of that and it was brilliant. And then my dad came in and he said, hey, Jay, he said, no, we've got you one more present. I was like, for me? And I've got two sisters, so I was like, I'm the fave. 14. I've got another present. Yeah, brilliant. He said, no, and it's not here. It's actually just next door in the other room, in the dining room. So he opened up the dining room door, and I walked in, 14 years old, and there was a brand new bike. Now, listen, you're 14. You're supposed to be a man. You've left boyhood behind. I involuntarily burst into tears. You see, I didn't realize this, but 2 couples in the church had heard about the bike being nicked. Without my mum and dad knowing, they plugged together and went out and bought a brand new bike for me. I didn't really know them. They didn't really know us. I was just a snotty-nosed 14-year-old kid. But you see, suddenly, the church was acting in a very distinct and amazing way. And so this impacted my life. These strangers who love Jesus have been unbelievably generous, and they have bought me a bike. I'd lived with that. That was probably one of the first times that I can really recall when the generosity of the church really broke into my life and touched my life. And I know there's loads of stories like that in this room and beyond, where the church and its love for Jesus has expressed itself in extraordinary generosity and touched many, many people's lives. That's where we're going today. We're going to talk about generosity. So why don't we turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 8. And this is Paul, and he's talking about an offering that they're taking up as he kind of works around the churches. And it's going to come up on the screen as well. And I forgot my glasses today, so, help go with me, all right? So this is Paul speaking to the Corinthian church. And he says, and now, brothers, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. That was probably the churches in Thessaloniki and Philippi. Out of their most severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. That's interesting, isn't it? Really tough time, absolutely skint, and yet something remarkable was going on in that community. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability, entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the saints. And they did not do as we expected. Don't we love it when people surprise us? That's what's going on here. But they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us in keeping with God's will. So we urged Titus, since he had earlier made a beginning, to bring also to completion this act of grace on your part. But just as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, and in knowledge, in complete earnestness, and in your love for us, see that you also excel in this grace of giving. I'm not commanding you, but I want to test the sincerity of your love by comparing it with the earnestness of others. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, might also become rich. And here is my advice about what is best for you in this matter. Last year you were the first not only to give, but also to have the desire to do so. Now finish the work so that your eager willingness to do it may be matched by your completion of it according to your means. For if the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has and not according to what one does not have. Our desire is not that others might be relieved while you are hard pressed, but there might be equality. At the present time, your plenty will supply their need, so that in turn their plenty will supply what you need. He who has gathered much did not have too much, and he who gathered little did not have too little. Okay. It's very interesting. So just let me give you a bit of a backdrop. Paul has been traveling around the churches across the sort of Mediterranean region where he'd planted churches. He's gone back and visited a whole bunch of them. And he did this once before where the church in Jerusalem was having a really tough time. And I just want to, sometimes we think, hey, this is the church in Jerusalem. This is the founding church. This is where Peter, James, and John, these great apostles, were based. And it says there that they're having a really tough time, and the church is in poverty and in need. And it just says something about, even in great leaders' times, sometimes things are tough. And so here is Paul, and he knows that. And so what he wants to do is he wants to raise some money across the churches and bless the church in Jerusalem. So that's the backdrop to this thing. He wants to alleviate some of the suffering. And in doing so, there's a couple of examples he draws on to just share, hey guys, this is what generosity looks like. And the first thing is this. Generosity isn't dependent on our circumstances. Generosity isn't dependent on our circumstances. The first example he talks about there is this Macedonian church. They are giving out of poverty. They do not have a lot, but they're giving sacrificially. Generosity is never about amounts, but it's always about the attitude in which it's given. Generosity isn't about rich people being able to give out of their surplus. He's saying here, generosity is a heart thing, attitude, isn't it? It's Jesus talks about this in Luke 21. Jesus is standing at the temple with his disciples and his friends, and they're gathered round, and there's a worship experience happening. And then there's this moment where people are bringing their, I know they said bringing their arms. They're bringing their arms. They're bringing their offering to God, and they're putting it in this big chest. And they're observing people. And some people are coming, and quite a lot of rich people are coming, and it looks like they're giving lots and lots of money. And then there's this little widow. I can just imagine this widow, an older lady, or maybe a granny, coming. And there she is, and she's coming up to this offering basket. And there she is, she puts in 2 little pennies. And then Jesus drops the bomb on Peter, James, and John and the guys, and he says, you see what she's just given? What she's just given there, more than anybody else. Why? Because she's given out of her poverty. She's given out of her heart. She's given substantially, pretty much whatever she's got, she's given. You see, generosity isn't about being ruled by our circumstances. It's about being ruled by who we love first, isn't it? These guys in Macedonia were giving sacrificially. I just want to throw this out here. Often we talk about gifts in our church. I love our worship and our worship leaders, and often I get very jealous, I think in maybe a godly way, I hope, but I look at them and I think, they're just like, yeah, they're just off on one, aren't they? And they're so talented, and, you just think, oh, this is a great gift, And then others, like we're talking about Ruth today, there's the gift of pastoral care. And I look at Sarah and the team, and they just have a gift with kids, don't they? I want to suggest to you today, generosity isn't a gift. We often talk about it like that because it ends in a gift. You receive something, don't you? Becomes a gift. I'm not sure if it is actually a gift. I think it's a character trait. That the example that Paul uses is Jesus. That Jesus gave up heaven and everything and all of that richness to become poor so that we would become rich. I think generosity is like one of the DNA strands of God's kingdom that should be running through each and every one of us. And so in earlier chapters, I think it's in 6, it says the prime goal of a Christian isn't to do great things for God, it's to become like him. Isn't that right? Jesus is generous in his character. I'm not sure if we suddenly are bestowed a gift of generosity. He's saying, no. What rules us is now the character of God in our lives. Our default, the default place of Jesus is I am going to be generous to people. It's a challenge, isn't it? To become a generous people. And so it is a response born out of love. Love for Jesus and a love for other people. So let's be honest, circumstances in our lives, they're going to change, aren't they? Let's look around the room for a second. Our circumstance, some of us have had times in our lives when we've been doing okay. And they're financially, things have been fairly secure and fairly good. I remember a time when me and Tor were both working. I was like, hey, this is all right. I mean, I haven't a clue what we did with the extra money that we had back then. We were young and just married and, neither of us are like, we haven't a clue. But there are times and seasons in our lives when you're going to have more. And then there are times and seasons in our lives when we're going to have less. But what's going to rule, the circumstances or our heart? You see what I mean? I mean, when we got married and we were both working, we were never rich, but we did have some extra. And so we would do stuff with the extra. When children come along, children are great. We love them to bits, but they cost. Not just in sleepless nights, but they cost. I just want to say to my kids, it's worth every minute. You got to affirm, but it's true, isn't it? I remember Tor saying to me, you get a chance. Hey, it's wheels, it's a pram, you get to choose the pram. I'm like, yeah. Some of you out there get this. I remember going to John Lewis, looking at a pram, 450 quid for a pram. It was like one of those multifaceted things. You needed a degree, all of that stuff. I'm like, wow, this is 400. My first car cost me 400 quid. It was a little bit temperamental, but it was a car. The pram, kids cost. Life changes. Suddenly Tor's not working. Suddenly we're down to one wage. It's like, things are tight. What are we going to do? We're going to have to kill off Sky. The TV dudes, we're going to have to remove this and remove that. And sometimes you have, and sometimes you don't. The question is, and what Paul's saying here, generosity is not ruled by our circumstances. Generosity comes out of here and our love for God. It's a character trait of Jesus. And Paul wants to encourage the church around this. It's not about how much. It's not about percentages. It's about heart. And I know you guys are a generous people. I know some of your situations, and I know there's been times over the years people have given in extraordinary ways and sacrificially. Wouldn't it be amazing that the world begins to hear of the generosity of the church? More and more. That is so countercultural, isn't it? In a world that's sucking and holding on to as much as it can, and the church is, like Herman, completely going the other way. No, we're just going to give some stuff away. Really? You did that? Why? Well, this stuff doesn't own me. Generosity is an attitude of willingness. I think that's what we see in this passage. Listen, the Macedonians, as we hear here, did not have deep pockets, but they had really big hearts. And I want to suggest that this big-heartedness came from two things. First and foremost, a love and commitment to Jesus. In verse, where is it? Let me look here. Yeah, verse 5, it says, and they did not do what we expected, which is cool in itself, isn't it? When people do things you didn't expect. And then it says here, and they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us. What's going on there? So two things. They're first utterly in love with Jesus. And then they are so for what Paul is doing and his heart to bless the church in Jerusalem. And that's twofold. One, it's about alleviating an issue, but it's actually, there's something else, another dynamic that's going with this offering, and it's about uniting the wider church. And we'll come to that. It says they gave themselves to the Lord. There's an openness, a devotedness to God. Hey, when you fall in love, for those of us that have fallen in love, something happens in your brain. It's like logic gets lost. You will be prepared to do weird and wonderful and crazy things for the person that you've fallen in love with. This is why people go out and buy ridiculous things for their girlfriends or boyfriends. They'll travel and swim oceans for love. You know what I mean? All of that stuff. Why? Because something happens. There's like a rerouting. Listen, the Macedonian church had been touched by God in such a way that logic in some ways had been rerouted, but faith was enormous. It's like their trust in who God is was like, he can do anything. I feel like the Macedonian guys that Paul's talking about here are probably had their lives touched a bit like Zacchaeus in the New Testament. And for those of you who don't know Zacchaeus was a tax man and a con man, and actually he had some moolah, he had some cashola, but he got it in ways and means that were somewhat dodgy. Let's put it that way. And so Jesus, it says, rocks up into Jericho. And as Jesus is walking along and there's a crowd with him, this guy, Zacchaeus, who's a wee dude, he's a little guy, he can't see over the crowd, so he does that thing, and he climbs a tree, and he's watching. And I just love it. The one guy in the whole neighborhood, in the whole town, Jesus picks out is the one guy that is one of the most influential people in the town for the wrong reasons. And he picks on Zacchaeus and he says, hey, Zacchaeus, I want to have dinner with you today. I love that. I just love how Jesus invites himself in. Now, we don't really know what happens in that house. But we have a taste of the after effects of a conversation with Jesus. You know what the after effects were? He says this. Zacchaeus says to Jesus, I will give half my money away. Just like that. He says, and all the rest of it, I will make sure I pay restitution and I resolve this issue where I have taken from other people. I'm going to use the network that I took to suck in and take from others. I'm going to use that whole network to become a blessing. What an incredible reversal. One lunch with Jesus causes a man to give away the very thing that he thought would give him security. One lunch with Jesus transforms that, changes it completely. You see, the Macedonian church had a powerful encounter with the love of Jesus, and so that was always the thing now that was going to rule their hearts and not the material. For us in our society, I just want to ask some questions, and I'm asking the questions myself. What play or place or percentage of influence does the material, the money, have in our lives? Is Jesus really number one? It's a good question. Paul is asking some of that. Because we want to be distinct. The Macedonian church had given themselves to Jesus first. And then it says in verse 5, and now they also gave themselves to Paul. Now what was that about? They got Paul's vision for this offering. You see, the offering was going to alleviate people's plight in Jerusalem. Now we reckon We reckon within probably between the first 5 and 10 years of the church growing in Jerusalem, they were serving and feeding up to 20,000 poor widows and orphans. 20,000 across the greater Jerusalem area. You know that moment in Acts where they're like, oh my gosh, there's so much to be done and we can't do it all. So they find 7 amazing godly people and give them a responsibility to feed the poor. This is what we're talking about. There is intense poverty in Jerusalem and the church is struggling to make ends meet. Paul gets it. He says, hey, let's go and help that. Let's show the brothers and sisters in Jerusalem that we're a part of that. The church has always invested in serving the poor. And to do that, we have to be a generous people. But there's another side to this thing, and that is this. In the early development of church, there was like people, especially in the Gentile territories, were coming in and trying to twist and reshape the gospel of grace. And trying to pull this gospel of grace that back into a legalistic religious experience. That actually was about rules and regulations. And that was happening all over the Gentile world. And it was causing a problem. By Paul taking an offering and taking it to Jerusalem, he was saying to the wider world and to the church in Jerusalem, hey, we are your brothers and sisters. We are united with you. We're putting our money where our mouths is because we believe we are the church of Jesus and we're in this together. You see, where money is invested, hearts are welded. Paul not only saw it about alleviating poverty, he saw this offering as a moment, a declaration to say we are to be a united people. We are not to be divided. It's brilliant. Listen, I love that we're a multi-site church. I love that when we give on a Sunday, in lots of different ways, whether we do it online or in the baskets, that this money is coming not only to serve the needs and the ministry of Catalyst Vineyard, but actually a whole chunk of this money that comes into us goes out to our partners all over the world. When Leslie and Shanti Matthews from Sri Lanka come and visit us, it's like they're like, hey, we're an extension of your family. Why? Because we are investing in what they're doing in Sri Lanka and seeing people come to Jesus and all of the ministry that they do amongst their 20-odd churches. When Paulin comes here from Albania, he stands here and it's like, listen, I am your brother, and the work that we're doing in Albania, we are deeply connected to. I want to say thank you because we're family. Why are we family? Because we love Jesus, but your resources are enabling me to do what we're called to do. And we could go through all of our mission partners. Over £100,000 went into these mission partners this year. Why? Because we want to be a generous church, a Macedonian church. And so generosity is a posture of willingness. And then finally, this, I think, is this, that generosity is displayed when we do what we have promised. When we move from intent to actual action. Verse 6, verse 10 and 11, Paul explains, doesn't he? He says about the Corinthians, hey, I came to you a year ago, you know, in a previous offering you gave, and you said if you were going to do this again, we're happy to give. And so he's holding them to their word, if you like. But since then, there's been some disagreement, and there's been some tough times. And so now Paul is coming back to them and saying, hey guys, you said back then that you would, and now I want you to finish and complete what you've said. Generosity is not just great intentions. Generosity is completing on the promise that we will actually come good on it. It's about not just discussing it, it's about putting some skin in the game. Great intent doesn't provide food for the hungry. It doesn't provide bricks for housing. It doesn't provide extra clothing. It doesn't provide, does it, for other ministries to flourish when it's just good thought and good intent and it's in here. But when it moves to actually becoming something, then it moves from intent to action. Generosity is when we complete on what we've promised. And I think, guys, just from a confessional standpoint, in my life, I've sat in meetings, I've heard people talk about certain projects or ministry moments, and there's, and in those moments, I thought, yeah, I need to probably give to this. I feel moved by it. I'll go and pray about it, and then I've got in the car and I've driven home, and by the time I've got home, I've justified why I wouldn't give. Because I've then looked at my circumstance. And don't get me wrong, we need to be wise about this stuff. We don't want to give out of debt. But something had moved from, I want to do that, I'm going to say I'm going to do that, to the intent was there. I felt like I'd heard God, but actually by the time a day or two had gone by, I actually haven't done anything with it. And Paul just wants to encourage the Corinthian church to act with integrity around this kind of stuff and say, hey, let's move from promising to actually delivering. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm guessing for lots of us in this room, isn't it incredible to receive, to be on the receiving end of a generous group of people? Over the years, Victoria and I have received from this church and beyond in extraordinary ways. And sometimes they were really significant, but maybe small things, but really significant in our lives. And there's been times where we've gone home and we know that there's not a lot in the cupboards. And actually, we've got people coming for dinner, and we've rocked up, and there's been shopping on our doorstep. I mean, things like that. You're like, wow, somebody somewhere heard God and moved from intent and possibility to reality, and that has blessed our lives. I remember coming home once, and one of our cars was knackered. It had broken down, I don't know how many times, and somebody just walked in and gave me a set of keys. They were giving me a car. I was like, wow, blown away. Hadn't asked for it. They just said, we see the need. You're running around like a headless chicken just for a change. Here is a car. It was an older car, but it was a great car. And we could make a list. And I know here in this church and beyond and to the other sides, happens a lot. It's brilliant to receive. But what Paul's trying to get to is when you get a chance to give and then celebrate, even sometimes quietly on your own, what that does is amazing. So let's move from intent to action. And I just want to land on this final little kind of part. Generosity is a DNA strand of the church. And we see it right in the beginning, in the birth of the church. There are three P's that happen, and you can look in the book of Acts, that clearly mark out this people, this Jesus followers, this group, this new community. One is power. Without a doubt, when the people of God get together, God's presence and power were palpable. People got healed. People fell over in the presence of God. We're singing songs like, show us your glory. When the glory of God, and what we're talking about there is the very essence and presence of God coming into the community, stuff happened. Demons fled. People keeled over. They got healed. It was messy. And people were like, wow, something's happening with those people. And for some people, that was a little bit scary. And for others, it was like, oh my goodness, my life has been utterly transformed by the power and presence of God. Power marked the beginning of the church. Also, proclamation. People had unbelievable courage. And not just the main disciples. Normal people, everywhere they went, from Acts chapter 8 in particular, they had courage to speak about Jesus. In every field and sphere of influence, they just couldn't help talking about Jesus because Jesus had transformed their life. In their jobs, in their lives, in their neighborhoods. How Antioch, the church in Antioch began is because the church had courage to share Jesus. So there's power, there's proclamation. And then I just want to suggest this. Right at the heart is this miracle of generosity or miracle of possessions. They gave up stuff. They were generous, with whatever they had so that everybody's needs were met. There was a sense of equality and unity together in it. A man called Joseph went and sold a field, it says, and he brought the proceeds to the disciples and said, hey, I'm all in. Have this. It's his inheritance he sold, and they called him Barnabas, son of encouragement. Whoa, that is an incredible encouragement, isn't it? So right at the very beginning, right at the birth of the church, is this countercultural spirit of generosity. I want us to be generous. I want to be generous. It starts with us as individuals. It will be expressed with us as a community. And I hope and I pray that we'll start to make a dent in our society. Generosity it's right at the heart of God. Why don't we stand?